Welcome back, everybody, to this Asheville Vedic Astrology channel. I'm here with a very special guest who is the chair of the NCGR, Joyce Levine, of joycelevine.com. She's the author of two books, A Beginner's Guide to Astrological Interpretation and Breakthrough Astrology, Transform Yourself and Your Life. And she also has a series of meditation CDs, all that can be found at her website. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that's very dear to a lot of your hearts, because I know I get a lot of questions about this, focusing on how astrology can help one understand their family dynamics, and even working with your children, which is one thing that I personally enjoy quite a bit, because in my mind it starts them off on the right foot. But anyway, Joyce, welcome to the channel. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Great. So where are you located? Are you in New York? Is that right?
No, everybody thinks I'm in New York, but I'm actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay. Well, for us Southerners, that's pretty much the same thing, right?
Well, I think I have a New York person. My father was from New York, and people see me as having a New York personality and not a Boston personality. But Gotcha. I've been in Boston for most of my adult life.
Okay. And you've been doing astrology for most of your adult life too, is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, so good. That's great. It gives you a lot of experience. And as we discussed earlier on, this is one of those careers where the longer you're in it, that's actually better, right? Because you, as you mentioned, you get to unlearn things and learn things better as you proceed.
I always tell my students not to believe everything they read in books, even mine, that They should test everything for themselves and see if it works.
Exactly. Good. And one of the things that you typically enjoy is working with families or working with children. Is that correct?
Well, generally I'm working with the parents, although there are times that the parents send in adult children. So,
right. How does that usually work? Because that's never really gone too well for me.
It depends. Actually, truthfully, it depends on the family and the child.
Okay.
So, I mean, on one hand, I'll get a call from a mother or a grandmother that a baby was just born and they want the baby's chart done at one extreme. On the other extreme, I have two clients who have just had their Pluto opposition. So if people that don't know astrology don't know what that means, that happens around 90. So there aren't too many people left by that time. And they're having, one of them is still, she gets her chart updated. She gets her children who are in their 50s and 60s charts done.
Right.
She gets her grandchildren's charts done. And so she sent her Atlantic in her grandchildren when she thought they needed some guidance. So nice. It's very extreme. A parent sometimes will have a child's chart done for themselves.
Right.
They want to get along better with the child or want to reach them in a way that they haven't been able to. And a mother, like with a newborn, may want to just see what kind of guidance they can give the child as the child's growing up. And it's amazing what shows in a baby's chart.
Right. And so with the children, you have a baby who's just been born. And, I've always thought that that's a wonderful thing to have done, because then you can speak about the child's personality, their quirks, their strengths, their weaknesses. So the parent can then, instead of impressing their own ideas on the kid, can know what the kid's all about. So
exactly.
When you approach that, what are the things that you mainly look at in relationship to the baby's chart or relationship to the parents and so on? How do you approach that?
Well, the first thing I do is talk to the parent, because if a parent is having a child's chart done and the child is 16, 20, 30, 40, there's distance.
Right.
When a parent is looking at a baby's chart, there is no distance. And so everything becomes very personal. And the baby's chart also reflects the parents or their view of the parents. And so that's not an accident.
Right.
And so, and people can be, it's really funny what can upset people or not upset people when you're looking at a child's chart.
Right.
Which is something that I've learned along the way. It's like, I remember years ago, I had this one woman who was a client, and she was a single mother, and she was having her son's chart done. And the father of the baby did not marry. And I said something about how charming her son would be and how good he would be with the ladies. Well, she was very offended by that. It's like, oh, he's going to take after his no good father.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And so it never occurred to me that something like that could be offensive.
Right.
On the other hand, there was one woman who came in, and this was a family that lived in like a rich suburb. Mm-hmm. She owned a little store. Her husband managed money. So we're talking about, elite. Right. And the woman had come in to me to have her chart done, and then she decided to have her children's charts done. So the oldest daughter at the time was about 7. And I looked at that chart and I went, oh my God, what am I going to say to this person? Mm-hmm. Because it was the most aggressive chart I had ever seen. Right. It was like Attila the Hun and a 7-year-old girl in a rich suburb. Right. and I said, I was like, I didn't know what I was going to, I had to tell her what the chart said, but I just didn't know how I was going to go about it. Right. Again, when you're working with parents with children, you have to be far more sensitive in the way you put things than you might if you were working with an adult. Right. And so when we got through, this was what shocked me. The mother said to me, "Good, it's not my fault." The child was already behaving that way. Right. And the next thing she said was, "And I won't have to worry about her." Right. So strong. So, yeah, exactly. So because she could take care of herself. Right. And so this is sort of, excuse me, that you kind of never know. I mean, if you have somebody's chart and you've been working with them for a long time, then you kind of know how they're going to react. Right. But there's a variety of ways that people can react to the same information. Mm-hmm. And people, again, are just, when it's children, particularly young children or babies, they're far more sensitive. Right, right. And so what I help the parents do is understand the child from the child's perspective. Mm. Because our charts for each of us is our view of the world. Right. It's not objective, even though we'd like to think so. Right. So I always tell my clients, the good news is you're meant to be this way, and sort of the bad news is this is what you have to live with. Right. But our charts are not just what we're like, but they're our view of the world. Mm-hmm. And so you see the world your way, I see the world my way. Each and every other person sees the world his or her way. Mm-hmm. And then we interact as if we're supposed to be seeing the same thing. Right. And when it comes to families, that creates more difficulties. Mm-hmm. There's some children that fit right in the family. It's a family pattern and they all, they agree. And then there's the child that doesn't necessarily fit in the family. Right. And that's a problem. Or a lot of times the child that's the parent that you're most like is the one you have the most problems with. Right. Yeah, that was going to be a point that I was going to bring up when you said fit in, not fit in. I mean, a lot of times you'll see families that have really strong Saturn-Mars conjunctions or Saturn-Mars oppositions in everyone's chart. Yeah. And that's where the problem comes in, right? Or can. Well, that's where the problem comes in. But the thing is, the more similar your charts are, the easier it is to understand someone when they behave a certain way. Well, ideally. Let me put it this way. It's one extreme or the other. Yeah. Either they really offend you because you see yourself in them, or you can understand what their behavior because it's similar to yours. Mm-hmm. When behavior is really different than yours, it's very hard to understand. Right. I can think of like one family. The mother's actually, the mother now is a good friend of mine, but she wasn't when she first came in. Mm-hmm. So she had her chart done, and then she sent in her daughter and her son were both in college at the time. And the mother, she's a wonderful person, but I don't think she ever showed up on time for anything in her entire life. Right. She has a strong Jupiter, and she's very generous, and she just expects things to go her way. Uh-huh. And her daughter, same type of chart. Hmm. Never showed up on time. She was very nice, but timely and considerate, no. Now the son, on the other hand, and the daughter, this was not a rich family. Uh-huh. The mother was sending the daughter on archaeological digs for the summer, and this was like not a family that this was like spare money. Right. The son had a strong Saturn, not a strong Jupiter. Mm-hmm. he showed up on time. He was responsible. He was working his way through college so that the family wouldn't have to pay for it.
Right.
And the mother said, you know, he always made things so hard on himself. Just see what I mean? Because he did not fit in with the family pattern.
Right.
And so even though he was, in a sense, the most hardworking and the most responsible among the entire family, he was the odd person out. So the odd person out isn't necessarily the one who's badly behaved.
Right.
It could be the sober person in an alcoholic family.
Exactly. Right.
So it's very interesting when you look at how people relate to one another and what their expectations are.
So when you're looking at the charts between families and so on, like when it comes to technique or the principles behind it, are you looking at, say, how certain planets lie over top of the houses? That, like, you've got two charts. You're looking to see, does Saturn on one person's chart affect the moon or the sun or the ascendant of another person's chart? What are you doing when you're looking to compare these types of things? Okay,
the first thing I look at all of that, but that's not where I start.
Okay, where do you start? Good.
What I start with, what is the sort of, and this is a little ambiguous in terms of explaining, because I'm just trying to think of how to explain this. It's more that we all have a certain nature. So I look at sort of how does the nature of that person fit in with that family.
Okay, so you look at the person's chart first by itself.
By itself, absolutely.
And try to figure out what its nature is.
In any relationship, I look at the person's chart by themselves.
Right, good.
And it might be easier if I explain some of this by example.
Okay.
Another example, like I have clients that I've had, like I picked their wedding date and their kids are now, the oldest is now in college. And so the parents are both Saturn and Capricorn. They're CPAs. You know, they did everything. They live by the rules.
Right.
They've done, they did everything they were supposed to. The wife was like really a driven executive, but when she had children, she stayed home because that's what a mother was supposed to do. Well, she had two kids that were, the oldest has the Uranus Neptune. Do you know what I mean? The kids are like from left field.
Right, yeah.
And they don't fit in that family whatsoever. In terms of, like, if you were looking at what traits got passed down.
Right.
And so in a family like that, or you really have to look at, okay, this is what you're like for the parents. However, that's not the same tune that your children dance to. They are not going to see things the same way.
Right.
Your son may be entrepreneurial, but he's not going to work for a Fortune 500 company. Do you see? So part of that is like assessing the nature of each individual.
Right.
And then looking at how those things overlap.
Well, I think that's extremely important. I mean, not only for families, but also just relationship compatibility.
I do that too with relationships.
Yeah, because there are these things, like even in Vedic astrology, where there's like a technique that you use where you go through and you do like a point-based system to figure out, is this couple compatible? And I think that's fine and all, but what I have noticed, just like what you're saying, is that, well, let's look and see who are these people individually first. Let's read person A's chart and person B's chart and see, do they even really have the same tastes? Right. And then we can get into these specifics. So I'm glad to hear that that's that you do that too.
Well, let me say this, and Vedic I am definitely not an expert on, but from what I understand, the things that Vedic astrologers are looking for compatibility are not the same things that a Western astrologer would be looking for.
The time, it kind of comes from a different time a little bit.
Like you'd be looking for, will they have children together? Will they be sick at the same time? Do you know what I mean?
Right.
We're looking at, how do you get along? And I've done charts for people who have had their Vedic charts done and the Western charts done, and they're compatible in both.
Right.
And I've done charts for people that have had the Vedic charts done and then the Western charts done, and they are not compatible in both.
Right. Well,
it depends on what culture you're living in.
That's exactly right. The culture makes a big deal. And, one thing that you can see in Vedic too is you can go through all those principles. Are they going to have kids? Are they going to be sick at the same time? Are they going to be on the same path? But they'll still get divorced because in our culture, they can't live together. They don't have the same
chemistry.
Right. So we got, I think we got to sort of apply that with a little bit of care, right? But if like what you're saying, you look and see who are these people, and do these people mesh? You know, is the recipe right? Is the chemistry right? That's a little more likely to make it succeed, from my experience too. So,
and mesh doesn't always mean the aspects between the charts are easy. It's, to me, two people who like to fight are going to get along better than if one person, I don't mean fight physically.
No. Well, it could be, but that's right. You're right.
You know what I mean? Two people who like to argue are going to get along better than if one person wants harmony and the other person is argumentative.
Right.
So even though two argumentative people may argue more, they may actually be closer.
Right.
And so
because they understand each other.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the kind of things I look for. And sometimes you get complete opposites. And if the charts are opposite, people fill in each other's holes. And so as they get along perfectly, as long as there's no major disagreement.
Right.
But when there's a major disagreement, they can't possibly understand how the other person could think the way they do.
Exactly. So just out of curiosity, with what I've learned through Vedic astrology, one of the things we look at for what you're describing are the planetary aspects to a person's moon. So, for example, if we see someone has like Mars and Saturn aspecting their moon, they're going to tend to understand a coarser, more aggressive, more disciplined kind of nature. Whereas if you've got Jupiter and Venus, they're going to be a little more jovial, a little more into luxury and diplomacy and these sorts of things. And so you get a Moon Mars Saturn person with another Moon Mars Saturn person, sure, they might go at it, but there's a mutual respect there in a way. But if you get like a Moon Jupiter, Moon Venus with Moon Mars and Moon Saturn, that Moon Jupiter Venus doesn't quite understand why.
Absolutely.
Do you see?
Yes,
Is that?
And sometimes we can attract people who are like us, or we could attract the opposite to sort of fill in our holes. And sometimes if people just understand where the other person is coming from, if that's a choice they've made relationally, then things start to change.
Right.
Because we all look at other people, I mean, we're human, through what we would mean if we did the same thing.
Exactly. If we had the same chart.
You know, like, well, what we is if they had our chart.
Right. Yes.
And so we judge behavior based on what that behavior means in our way of thinking. But that's not what the behavior necessarily means in someone else's way of thinking. I mean, years ago, I had this woman come in. Her chart was all water. You know, she had
a lot of water signs, right?
Water signs, yes. Yeah. She had a lot of planets in Scorpio. I think she had Cancer rising. Everything was water. And she and her husband was like all air, Aquarius, detached. And they were having a lot of problems. And she said, he never listens to me. I tell him how I feel all the time, and he doesn't want to hear it. I said, well, stop using the word feel and use the word think and tell him the same thing. He actually started to listen.
Yeah, that's great.
You see what I mean? Like,
I do.
It sounds very simplistic, but sometimes these little things actually really work very well with people.
Right. Now, there's a book called The 5 Love Languages. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but
actually it sounds interesting.
Yeah, and we all have one of 5 love languages, which means like some people need to be given gifts, some people need touch, some people need to communicate. And I've always thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if an astrologer could write a book on the love languages, you know, so that you, like what you're saying, if you've got all air, well, then you need to tell the person how you think versus how you feel. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's good.
And so, and those little things actually really make a difference in how people can communicate. I mean, not that long ago, I had a couple coming in and the wife was ready. They had 2 children, tons of money. And the wife was ready to like walk out, and her chart was all earth, and her husband's chart was all fire.
Right.
and he was driving her crazy. Right. And she thought that because of his behavior, he didn't care. And I go, no, he's just being himself.
Right.
And believe it or not, that actually changed things.
Just having that knowledge.
Well, she also had really tough cycles. Because the other part is sometimes you make a bet, like relationally, and now we're talking more about relationships than the family.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Well, it's family.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes you just make a bad choice and you should get out. On the other hand, sometimes you're in a bad period of time.
Right.
And you need to let that time pass to see whether or not you feel the same way rather than doing something impulsive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the ways that astrology can really help people. Because sometimes, like, you've got a bad cycle, but it's giving you the courage to make a change that you wouldn't make normally. And that's like a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Other times, you can't tolerate something because it's what's going on in your own psyche at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's as much you, if not more you, than the other person. And so if you can give people a timing of like when that's likely to be over or what they're going through personally,
Right.
because your cycles are yours regardless of who you're involved with.
Mm-hmm.
And this actually, if we take that back to children, how the parents get along show the baby's chart.
Right.
Because the family axis, which is the 4th, 10th axis in the chart, shows the relationship between the parents at the time of birth.
Right.
And how the child fits into that. And that's why, particularly in large families, you see, or families where there's a big space between, a time space between when children are born,
Mm-hmm.
you'll see the parents described completely differently.
Yes, right.
Completely differently in the children's charts, because they weren't born into the same environment. The parents weren't getting along the same way.
Right.
Whether it's better or worse.
So that's why, like, you can have one child born and he moves out as soon as he turns 18, but the other child just stays there forever because they have a totally different experience of what the family dynamic is like because their chart's different in the time they were born.
Exactly. In fact, that same woman, that same family,
right,
that had the daughter that was Attila the Hun,
mm-hmm.
She had the second child was also an Aries. The third child was a Taurus with Cancer rising.
Uh-huh.
She didn't want anybody but her mother.
Ah, interesting.
She didn't. The other two could care less if they were left with the nanny, if they were left on their own. They were perfectly happy by them, without supervision or without parental attention. The third one didn't want to be without her mother. And all this woman's friends were saying, well, it's your third child, you're not going to have another one. This is you. It's not the child.
Right.
Said, no, it's the child. It's not your imagination. This
Right.
child does not want, and this child didn't even want to be left with the father, never mind a stranger for babysitting.
Right. So you brought up some good points that I would like to explore.
Sure.
And I'm going to try to remember them all because they were all really good. Number one, let me just state them so I've got them in my head. Number one, you were talking about cycles, the cycles a person's in, so hold that. The other one, you talked about the 4-10 axis as being the axis of what was going on with the mother and the father or the parents when the child was born. Okay, so those are the two things I want to focus on. Now, going back to the cycles.
Yep.
So what I'm thinking about is that, in Vedic astrology, we use transits as well, but we also use planetary cycles. And there are certain people who are always in relationship turmoil. And then there are certain people who, they're doing well for 20 years and all of a sudden they go through like a rough patch, a rough transit or so on. And that would be a situation where you might say, okay, before you bail, let's look at this time period and wait before you make a big decision so you're not influenced by that. So that makes perfect sense to me. I'm glad to hear that. But when you're talking about cycles, are you talking about things like progressions? And if so, since most of our audience is getting into Vedic astrology, can you describe a little bit of what that's about?
Sure. Actually, when I'm talking about cycles, I'm talking about transits, progressions, and solar arcs.
Okay,
So
transits, progressions, solar arcs. Gotcha.
Transits are the relationship of the planets in the sky
to
where the planets are in your birth chart.
Okay,
and those those can be favorable, they can be challenging, and there's never just one thing going on.
Right.
Because you're looking at, well, we use more planets than you do in Vedic. So
some of us use the name all the planets. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah.
Typical Vedic.
Typical, yeah, right.
So there's Pluto, which is usually a cycle of loss or changes that are beyond your control.
Right.
Or Neptune, which is idealism or illusion.
Mm-hmm.
People with strong Neptune can be visionaries or they can be con artists.
Right, yeah. Right.
Or they can easily be conned.
Right.
Uranus, which is the planet that has to do with sudden change.
Uh-huh.
Saturn, which is sort of duty or responsibility. And Jupiter, which is opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And So those are those 5 planets set up the major planetary cycles.
Because they move so slowly and they impact you more.
Exactly. Like if you're upset by the moon, you'll be upset for an hour or 2.
Right.
If you're upset by Pluto, you'll be upset for 3 to 5 years.
Right. Okay. Big difference.
Big difference. The second thing that you mentioned, or that you mentioned, are progressions. Now, progressions is a slow movement. It's a symbolic movement of the planets. Mm-hmm. So if you were, an ephemeris is a book that lists all the planetary positions. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you were 30, you would look at 30 days at this. I'm simplifying this because it actually needs to be calculated.
Yeah, I understand. That's fine.
You'd look at 30 days after you were born, where those planets are, and you'd look at the relationships of those planets to your birth chart and the relationships of those planets to each other. Okay. And those set up cycles. Now, by progression, the moon changes signs, or by the moon completes a full cycle in 28 years, approximately.
Okay.
So by progression, the moon is changing signs about every 2.5 years.
Okay.
And just by the sign it moves into, that you will start to notice changes. Mm-hmm. And it's not like you wake up one day and go, okay, now I'm different today.
Right.
But you'll start to notice, if your progressed moon goes into Leo, you suddenly like red clothes. Mm-hmm. Or
well, the moon, that can be very helpful, right? Because it changes every 2.5 days, 2.25 days, and then you attribute that to the years.
Right.
You could look at every segment of 2.25 or 2.5 years to see how that moon might change maybe your emotional nature or how you're perceiving the world or what you're interested in. Is that what you're doing?
Well, when things change by progression, things do change what you pay attention to.
Okay.
It's not instead of the birth chart. You're thinking of it as in addition to.
In addition to, right.
So, for instance, in my birth chart, I have no Earth. Mm-hmm. Earth is the practical material approach to life. I mean, I became an astrologer a long time ago. That was not practical.
You seem pretty well-grounded for an astrologer, and most of them are, way out there.
No, I have no Earth, but I have a very strong Saturn.
Okay. That helps, yes.
Saturn dragged me into reality.
So you didn't want it.
Well, I was much more idealistic when I was younger.
Yeah.
I got realistic when I actually had to make a living.
Right. Yeah, that'll do it.
But
anyway, back to the moon. Yes.
Back to the moon.
Yes.
So it's not just the moon, but when the sun changes, depending on what degree your sun is because it's 30 degrees in a sign.
Right.
So depending on what degree your sun is, that many years after, minus from 30, mm-hmm. Your progressed sun will move into another sign.
Right. Okay.
All the other planets move at a rate of speed you'd have to calculate.
I understand. Yeah.
But when those things change, you start to change the way you look at things. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, the only time I was ever good with plants, my progressed moon was in Taurus.
Interesting.
After it left Taurus.
Yeah.
And then the cats finished the rest. But,
right.
But I have no Earth in my birth chart. When my progressed planets went into Earth, and at the time I was I was extremely idealistic before that. Mm-hmm. And I was living the Boston area used to have rent control, which we don't have anymore. Mm-hmm. But I was living in this rent control apartment that was actually not very nice, but it was low rent. Mm-hmm. And one day I woke up and I said, geez, my friends are buying houses and condominiums. Why am I living here? Mm-hmm. My progressed planets have moved into Earth. I never noticed.
Interesting.
So you start to, the point is you start to pay attention to things that you didn't pay attention to.
Right. Okay.
Not that you're not completely different.
Right.
But it's sort of like adding another layer.
Well, so with the progressions in relationships and paying attention to other things, I understand what you're saying, that if it's dealing with the relationships, that maybe you start to notice more of your own personal flaws in a relationship or notice things that you didn't see before in others. If a progressed planet changes how you see the relationship, is that what we're getting at here?
Well, I think it's more what you pay attention to, which then changes how you see things.
Okay.
So for instance.
So your spouse might have been a total Star Trek nerd his entire life, but now you're realizing it and you're sort of like, gee, I don't know about that, right?
Well, say a person has no Earth.
Okay.
They marry somebody that can't make a living.
Okay.
Okay.
Gotcha. Right.
And then their planets move into Earth and they go, what did I do here? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I understand. Yeah, that makes sense.
Again, or say a person has no water in their chart and they can't express their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And their planets progress into water signs, and they get better at expressing their emotions. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on what kind of relationship you have, that may be good or it may be a problem.
Right.
As we kind of build it, as we go through cycles, whether it's progressions or transits, and we look to change or grow, the people around us may think that's a great idea, or they may want the old person back.
Exactly. Right. Well, this is fascinating. I mean, this whole progression thing I've always been fascinated about. And so hopefully I'm going to find some good lectures on it at that NCGR conference in February. By the way, what are you speaking on at that conference?
Actually, because I'm organizing the whole thing, I'm actually not speaking.
Oh, you're not speaking. Okay.
I was going to actually speak on relationships.
Okay. Well, we'll make up for it here.
But once I got
promoted.
Once I got promoted, it gave me more additional work, and I felt like I gave my lecture spot to someone else.
I'm glad we're having this talk now then, right? Because you were going to talk about it there. Is that correct?
I was going to talk about relationships there. And there is another conference coming up in 2018 where I will be talking about family dynamics.
Okay. Excellent. Is that the United...
Yeah, the United Astrology.
Yeah. Okay. 2018. Good.
But for people who, the next conference is the February 2017 in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And for people that are interested in our website is NCGR Conference 2017, and people can find out all the information. And this conference has a wide variety of speakers on a wide variety of topics. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll put a link to it as well down below.
Great. It's called The Many Faces of Astrology, and the idea of that is to show as many different expertises in different types of astrology as possible.
Right. Excellent. Well, I'm sorry that you're not going to be speaking, but I will see you there, and we will continue this conversation. Sorry for the sidetrack. Let's go back to the progressions. Right. So you're talking about the progressions and the changes people go through. And one other thing you mentioned was that a person might change, and the other people around them might appreciate that or might not appreciate that.
Exactly.
And one thing I have noticed, oddly enough, is that when I've done some charts for people that were in a difficult space, and I would say, once you get to this time period, your relationship's going to get much better. And what actually happened was it got much worse. And I'm curious what you think about this, because I've always found this to be interesting. What they noticed was what was actually wrong with their relationships that they had not admitted. And so it got worse. And then they met someone who actually fit more their long-term nature. And so I'm always curious about this. When you're looking at someone's chart, does that ever happen? Or
their relationships got better, just not with that person.
Exactly. Right. But they don't think about it that way. They just take it as though you said it was going to get better, and it actually got worse. But then, like you said, a few years later, they'll come back and say, well, that actually worked out. So I think that's important for people to understand that that's a possibility.
Well, also, I think it depends on what kind of cycle from my standpoint, it would depend on what kind of cycle it is.
Okay. Clarify that a little bit.
Okay.
Like, are there particular cycles that would...
Yeah, it's sort of... And it depends on what kind of person it is to begin with.
Okay.
So, for instance, say a person who has a very strong Jupiter-Neptune in their birth chart and a weak Saturn. Mm-hmm. So that person is going to be very romantic, very idealistic, always wanting to see the best in people.
Okay.
And ignoring
the reality.
What doesn't, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit that. Saturn comes along and they go, oh my God, did I get fooled, or how could I be so stupid, or why didn't I see this before?
Right.
They may never recover from that.
Hmm.
Some people, and again, this is the intersection of fate and free will.
Okay.
Because to me, and I think this is where Western differs, at least from traditional Vedic.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's an element, it's like I had clients that were twins.
Yes, my wife's a twin, so I understand this.
My mother was a twin.
Yeah.
But it was with a brother, so it wasn't as... But they both had marital the older twin, maybe maybe 5 minutes, got married first. Their lives went along pretty much the same way until they both had marital problems. One stayed married and one got divorced. And then their cycles from that split. But the thing is, they made different choices at that point in time. And so I think that there's an element of free will here. One decided to stay with the husband and work things out. And one decided that that wasn't what she wanted to do.
Right.
And so, but I think it also depends. So I think Saturn wakes you up, but there's still an element of like, what do you do with what you've got kind of thing.
And some people can handle that and some people can't, right?
Or some people want to.
Right.
There's also a willingness.
Yeah.
And then but if you have Pluto cycles, you're in the hands of fate.
Is that because you don't know what's going to happen, or what do you mean by that?
You can't control what happens.
Okay.
See, with Saturn, it's sort of like if you did a good job, you'll get rewarded, but you'll get more work. Or if you've ignored something, this is the time that it's like to clean out the stuff you've piled in the closet that you didn't want to look at.
Right.
I think there's different levels of consciousness. I think there's what we know about and we've dealt with, what we know about and we haven't dealt with, but we kind of know that it's there even if we've been ignoring it. And then there's what we didn't know existed. And that's Pluto's domain. It's the unconscious.
Right. So it's the things that come up that we were not expecting. We had no awareness about. It's just there. And now we have to. And
we have no control over. See, that's the biggest thing.
Okay.
So we can't, with Saturn, you can steer things. With Pluto, I mean, I remember I had Pluto when in the 80s, Pluto was on my sun. And that was, I mean, I thought I was so smart at that point. I'm a much better astrologer after being humbled.
Right.
But I thought, because everything that was going right in my life at that point had come under Saturn cycles. So I said, I worked hard. I deserved it. I'm not going to have trouble with Pluto. It's my ruling planet.
Right.
Wrong.
Yeah.
And the things that I was invested in just disappeared. And it had nothing to do with whether it was a good job or a bad job or whether I'd done anything right. It was sort of like it just wasn't meant to be. And so if a Pluto cycle ends, you can't tell, it's not likely that somebody's going to get back what they what they lost. Right.
It's just, yeah, I see. That makes sense.
I mean, it's sort of like you have to give in to fate. You either let go willingly. You have to learn to let go and be humble, which is not an easy thing. And again, depending, like right now, Pluto's in Capricorn, and we look at what's going on with big business and structure. And
all right.
Pluto always brings out, but in mundane events, what's going on in the world, it brings out the dark side of the sign. In your personal life, Pluto cycles, in a sense, what I would say is they return you to your essence, but it may not be the essence you think you have.
Right. Interesting.
And what's not meant to be in your life goes. And a lot of times what you think is going to happen is not what happens, because if you can think about it, that's probably not it. Right. Like years ago, I had a woman, she was having Pluto cycles and she was in her 50s and she had to have a hysterectomy. And she said, oh, that's my Pluto cycle. I go, you're in your 50s. You had 7 kids. I don't think that a hysterectomy is... Right. Not that anybody wants a hysterectomy. Right. But I don't think that a hysterectomy is the end of your Pluto cycle. Because
it's not challenging her sense of self in regards to having children, that sort of a thing? Is that what you...
It's not regarding... And she was very Catholic. And she had been separated from her husband for years, but would not get divorced because it was against the religion. Right. During her Pluto cycle, her sister was in the hospital on life support, was not going to ever get better. And she was the person that had to make the decision of whether or not to pull the plug. That's the Pluto cycle. Okay, right. So it's not just that it was life and death, but it challenged everything that she had believed in before that she had to let go of because she knew her sister would not want to continue to live. Right. Where she was never going to get better. And so that's dramatic, right? But it's a Pluto cycle, right? So then that speaks to that whole idea of
it really depends most certainly on what planet is causing the issue or the change in perception through these kinds of progressions that we've been discussing.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so the only time I usually usually I don't give people, like, I tell them what to do. I sort of lay out the information and let them make their own choices.
Right.
The only time I don't do that is when people have like heavy Neptune transits, and because Neptune can be illusion.
Right.
And when Neptune is triggering the 7th house, which is the marriage,
yes,
and people want to get married, I usually tell them to wait till the cycle's over, which could be 2 years. People don't really want to wait 3 years.
Right. I know. I know. Yeah.
My experience has been when they didn't listen to me.
Yeah. Because they're caught up in the illusion of divorce. Yeah. Well, let's take it from another angle then. With that Neptune idea, I understand what you're saying, that if they get married during that time, they're not really clear-headed about who the other person is or what the relationship is about. Is that what you're getting at with that?
That's what I'm getting, yes.
Okay. And so what happens if, say, someone's in, they've been married a while, and all of a sudden they go through Neptune moving over their 7th cusp or 7th house, these sorts of things. Would that also be a time period where you might say, keep your head out of your ass and don't make any major changes? Or what would you,
Well, I mean, if they're already married,
yeah.
they might be missing the romance in their marriage.
Okay.
See, with Neptune, you want things to be ideal and wonderful.
Ideal, right. The idealism, right. Okay.
And if you've known somebody a long time, the chances are that it's still romantic aren't really high.
Yeah, right.
That's not something that most people kind of want to think about. But it's, the longer you've known somebody, the more likely you are to take them for granted. And the truth is, it's not what we should do, but it's what everybody does.
Right.
And so Neptune comes along, and it's like, my spouse isn't, I'm going to be sexist here.
It's okay.
For a man, maybe my wife isn't beautiful enough.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Maybe,
the desire just isn't, that kind of thing.
Marilyn Monroe would go for me now, or
right. The idea, yeah.
Or for a woman, my husband isn't affectionate enough. He doesn't bring me flowers anymore.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? He's not romantic. And maybe this guy at the gym would be more attentive.
Exactly. Right.
And so you have to be careful at that point of throwing things away.
Right.
For what's a short-term ideal or illusion.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, I think if people knew that, that could really help them, long-term marriage, also in getting married, these sorts of things. So, that's probably one of the joys of having astrology in our life, is that if we know that, if we can see that, then maybe we can make choices that are not necessarily out of that illusion or out of on autopilot, right? I mean, that's a good, I think it's good to know when those Neptune and Pluto and Uranus transits happen.
Uranus, you might want more excitement, or you might be less tolerant.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the client that I mentioned, who's now 90, when, I can't remember how old she was. It was probably 30 years ago. I hate to admit it. She had Uranus transiting her 7th house cusp. Mm-hmm. And the 7th house is the marriage partner as well as your relationships. And she came in, she said, my husband is impossible. I'm getting a divorce. And I said, well, you've been married. I don't even know how many years at that point.
A while.
Like 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, do me a favor and just wait until these cycles are over and see if you still feel the same way.
Mm-hmm.
She came back when the cycles were over. And she said, he's a lot easier to live with now.
Ah, nice.
But it was her cycles.
Right.
That's the thing that people don't realize.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't mean that other people don't behave in a certain way,
mm-hmm.
but at that point in time, that's who we're drawing in.
Mm-hmm.
Or we see things that way, whether or not they are that way.
Right. Well, so we'll just take this idea a little bit further if we move into that other topic, the one with the 410 access. Yep. And I want to make sure, do you still have some time? Are we doing okay with time?
Fine.
Okay, great. Good. Glad booked it up. So when we're thinking about this and we're looking at, say, transits of like the 7th house, that makes perfect sense. Do you, in Western astrology, or the particular tradition you follow, would you also look at, say, those planetary transits to like the ruler of the 7th house or Venus? I mean, does it have the same kind of... Okay. And
Yeah.
do they have the same kind of impact though, or is there different depending on whether it's the house or the Lord or?
It depends on, like, for instance, if Venus rules your seventh house and it's to Venus, then it's going to have a huge impact.
Right, because it's Venus and the seventh house Lord.
Yes.
Right.
The
Okay.
natural ruler. So
Right.
I would put anything aspecting an angle
Mm-hmm.
is primary.
Okay, and that's a difficult aspect, right? A harder aspect.
Yes, a harder aspect. I hate to say this, but frequently easy aspects don't produce anything. People don't want to, nobody wants to hear that.
Right.
It's like the more favorable aspects work if they're setting up something that's already there in your birth chart.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have Venus trine the midheaven and you get Jupiter and Scorpio, Jupiter conjuncting Venus and trining the midheaven, then that's great.
Right.
For both your love life and your profession, your career.
Right. Because you've already got it there.
Because you've already got it there.
Yeah.
If you don't have that kind of a relationship, it can be activated, but you have to do something to activate it. It just doesn't happen on its own.
Right.
And I know that's.
I think that makes perfect sense. No. I think that makes perfect sense because that's one thing that, comes up a lot in these questions that I get are, when am I going to win the lottery? When am I going to get in a relationship? When am I going to have my business work out? And I say, look, it's got to be in your birth chart first before a trigger transit will actually just make it happen. Otherwise you have to do something, during when the transit is supportive. So I think I'm fully on board. That's been my experience too.
And for something like being lucky in gambling, if you don't have it in the birth chart, you're not going to ever have a time that's lucky enough.
Oh, I know.
For the most part.
Yeah, I've got a few clients that they've got it in their chart. They've got a wonderful setup for gambling and they win all the time. And then I've got these other folks that are buying lottery tickets all the time, wanting me to pick the right time. I say, it's not in your chart.
No, they don't want to hear it. I had one client, it was her win, but her husband, I never talked about gambling because it's not on my radar.
Uh-huh.
And so she
I know, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? If it's not what you think about, you don't look at it in the chart.
Right.
And so she asked me about gambling. And the first time I told her she had a lucky day, she won like $5,000 or something. The second time, she didn't win it. She was in Atlantic City with her husband, and they won $200,000 at a slot machine.
Wow.
But those kind of cycles come along once in a life if they ever come along.
Right.
You can't look at somebody's chart every year and say, maybe you could find a time to win $20.
Right.
But you're not going to find a time that for that kind of a win.
Right.
You're not a lucky person to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that I want to stress that point only because I think it's one of the major points that people need to get through their head. Is that if something is in your chart and you get what you mentioned, like an easier transit, then that's when those things are naturally going to occur. But otherwise, these harder transits that we consider angular transits and so on, things occur because you were inspired to work towards them, right? You're inspired to grow into something greater, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And I just want to say one more thing about whether or not you're lucky. I don't have a lucky chart, unfortunately. I wish I did, but I don't.
Yeah.
And the last time I looked for a lucky day, I went to the track and my friends hit the superfecta.
So your friends are lucky, right?
So I got dinner, but no money.
Yeah. Well, I want to be your friend then. Anyway, that's always a funny point, since we're talking about relationships. One of the things I've always noticed is that, you tend to attract the same kinds of people around you all the time. Like when I moved from one city to another, I met almost verbatim the exact same theme, the exact same cast of characters. So I've always found that if I see someone who has lucky friends, I want to be their friend because then I'll be lucky. Yeah. But anyway, well, let's go ahead and move on to the other topic, and that is looking at the 4th and 10th house.
Yep.
You said that was the state of the parents at the time of birth, right? And how they're going to relate to them?
Well, it's how they're relating to one another and
how
how
the
that
parents
affects you.
Right, okay.
Some astrologers see the 4th house as the mother, or
Right.
10th house as the mother. It's an axis.
Right.
Typically, the 4th house is like the interlinked parent. There's no guarantee that that's the mother or the father. Do you know what I mean? I always,
do.
So I would say to somebody,
it's the mothering energy.
It's, one parent was like this, the other parent was like that. Who does it describe, kind of thing? You can talk to your clients. Mm-hmm. But the relationship between any planets in the 4th and 10th house to each other, the relationship of the rulers to each other, to a large degree describes the condition of the parental relationship at the time that you were born.
Okay.
And so that's going to have an effect on you.
Right. Because that's how you're going to see like the archetype of each parent. Is that how we would?
It's how you see what your family was like
At that time.
At that time, but the thing is, at that time is fixed for you.
Right.
So, for instance, if you see this a lot in large families, actually, I just did a talk on family dynamics at a conference in Buffalo in Soda. And one of my examples was I had a chart with, I had an example with a woman with 6 children. And just as you might expect, the oldest had a strong Saturn. The oldest was a daughter. She was responsible for taking care of the younger siblings. The mother worked.
Right.
The youngest child had a strong Jupiter. Everything, he got things easy, things were given to him, and he's an adult now, and the mother's still paying his bills. Whereas the oldest child has worked for everything she's gotten.
Right.
And so it's the condition, part of it's birth order, but it's not just birth order. It's the condition of the family at the time that the person's born. Like the oldest child had Saturn, which is the planet of discipline, duty, responsibility, in the 4th house, which is the family.
Right.
And so the family wasn't that well off at the time she was born. And given the conditions of her family, she had a lot of responsibility early.
Towards the family?
Towards the family.
Yeah, okay.
So and whereas the youngest child had a strong Jupiter there.
Right.
He got the benefit of everything that the family may have gained.
Right.
During the years.
Yes.
But it's also, if there are difficult aspects between planets in the 4th house and the 10th house, then that can show that your parents were basically not getting along very well at the time you were born. And that's going to affect you. Right. And so, life isn't an accident.
No, I agree. So when you see that, that's always been an interesting point for me because, like you, I love doing charts for little kids, like children. Not when they're 18 or 16, because at that point in time, I think if you don't know them by now, but it's just the little ones because, when you can see the chart of a child, then that allows you to understand how to relate to them. But the difficult thing I've always had is relating information to a parent when it's been a difficult aspect or stellium or situation with the 4th house or the 10th house and trying to describe them. This is kind of the relationship that they perceive between you and the father or you and the mother and so on. And, how do you encourage people to be aware of that without feeling so bad about it? Or do you understand kind of what
I do. And what I always tell people is I don't believe that birth is an accident. I think your moment of birth, whether this is true or not, I believe that we agree to come into the world at a certain time and that determines our fate. And so the child chose that chart. Right. So this would be the child's chart, no matter who the parent was. That a lot of times helps. You never want to, a parent never likes difficult news when it's an infant. Right. With a 20-year-old, it's easier to take. Yeah. But it helps them to understand that it's not their fault. Right. Because it's the child's fate.
So, that brings up another interesting point because I've, having this conversation with people too who have really difficult charts. And I'm not talking about a child. I'm saying a client who comes to you and they've suffered a lot of abuse and they want to know the why and everything. And you can look at it and say, well, you were born with this chart, which means that these other people in your life were just fulfilling the role that your chart had set up for you. And that's also a hard one to stomach too, right? Because then that's going to require a lot of, if you're into blaming, that requires a lot of self-responsibility. How do you approach that? Or is
it's a challenge, and it's not just in terms of parents. I mean, I had one woman get really mad at me because I described her ex-husband in her chart.
Right.
And she chose him.
Right. Right.
Now, when I wasn't looking at his chart, I was describing him based on her chart.
Right. That's
And
great.
so it wasn't an accident that she picked that kind of person. And believe me, she did not want to hear that.
Right.
So this is sort of where astrology, the art, has to balance the science.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, one, you have to look at the person's chart and see. For me, when I look at someone's chart, it talks to me. I mean, I don't mean I'm hearing voices, but
Right.
I look at the chart and I see the person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, based on what I see in that chart, is the way I'm gonna speak to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really have a rule of how to approach it.
Right.
And I tell them, I don't know why we have the fate we do. I just know that we do.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't do karmic astrology. I don't believe in, you screwed up in your. I don't know if I should have said that, but
It's all right. No.
in your past life, and now you're getting punished. I think that's an awful way to look at things.
Yeah. Well, no. I agree. I look at it as though you just make choices, and this is the results of your choices. You eat bacon every day for every meal, and you're going to have a heart problem. Like it's not a karmic thing. It's just.
But I do believe that. I mean, is it that the person was a bad person in their last life, or is it because there's certain things that they need to understand so that they can help others in this life?
Right. And we can't know that as astrologers, right?
And typically the people with the easiest charts are not the nicest people.
Interesting.
So you have to remember that. Difficult aspects means that you struggle with something or that it creates a challenge for you. Mm-hmm. Easy aspects mean that you do something easily. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that what you do is good. It just means it's easy for you. You don't have a problem with it. That doesn't mean no one else does.
Right. Right.
So you would be surprised at, what can be an easy aspect. Say you have a strong Jupiter. Mm-hmm. And actually I was just going through this with a client yesterday. She has Jupiter in the second house. Great for making money. It's got good luck with finances. Mm-hmm. Well, she's 69 now and doesn't have money. Mm. It's not that she didn't make money. She blew it all.
Right. Yeah.
So do you know what I mean? Don't think that good aspects necessarily mean good results.
No, I think that's a very important point because, for example, if you've got more harder aspects to temper the good aspects, then yeah, sure, you can accept grace with the more positive aspects. But when things go wrong, you don't immediately crumple. You just use your Saturn, you use your Mars, and you get up and say, all right, I'm going to do something about this. In Vedic astrology, we treat Saturn and Mars as what we call Temasek planets, which do things because there's a problem.
Oh, interesting. I never heard that before. I knew they were considered malefics.
Yeah, they're considered malefics, but the idea of Temasek is that you do something because there's a problem. And sometimes that's fine. Like Mars is the engineer, the inventor. He likes to fix things that are broken, right? And so he will do something when there is a problem. So anyway, point being is that when you get these planets strong, well then, when a problem comes up, you can tap into them and you can make positive changes. So I think it's very good for people to remember that it's not just one way or the other. It's not cruel or malefic, or it's not, good or benefic. It's, you have a good combination of both in a sense.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I've really appreciated you doing this because you've touched on some really good points. And again, your website, just to be clear, it's JoyceLevine.com, correct?
JoyceLevine.com, yes.
Okay, and we'll put that down at the bottom here. And on that website, you'll be able to find her book, schedule a session, even her CDs. Is there anything else? We talked about a lot. But I know that you have a deep interest in relationships and astrology. Is there anything else that you have in mind that you wanted to share? Or did we cover most of it today that you wanted to? I know there's probably a lot more.
I think the most important thing to remember is for each person that our charts are a reflection of our lives. Mm-hmm. And what happens to us, there's an intersection between fate and free will. Mm-hmm. And the choices we make at a given time determine the next set of choices. Mm. And it's really important to understand what we're like to begin with so that we understand our own biases.
Right.
So a person with a strong Jupiter It's jovial, they're fun, they're easy to be around. But they may make choices as if they're always going to be lucky and they're never going to have a bad time. Mm-hmm. A person with a strong Saturn may be fearful and always afraid something's going to go wrong, which is not necessarily, like if you talk to a person with a strong Saturn, if you say, I want to talk to you, the first thing they'll think of is, what did I do wrong?
Right.
You talk to a person with a strong Jupiter and they'll think, oh, am I getting a promotion?
Yeah. That's great.
So neither of those ways of thinking may be accurate. It's our bias. Uh-huh. And so we need to understand what our biases are based on our charts, mm-hmm. so that we can, in a sense, put in the correction, because that's where the fear rule comes in.
Right, right.
So the more we understand ourselves, the better we can't get rid of our fate, mm-hmm. but as I tell my clients, we're meant to be the way we are, but we all need to be tweaked. Uh-huh, right. We can choose where we're going to be tweaked, uh-huh. and by understanding ourselves better.
Excellent.
So to me, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent message to close on. So thank you. All right, well, we'll conclude here, and maybe if you're up for it, we can do another one of these interviews a little bit further into the future, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, no, this is great. This was fun.
Yeah, if the transits are accommodating. Anyway, all right, yes. Well, it was good talking to you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.